threatening legal action over his removal from the Revenue Service by the President last night. But that's not the only big story we're following tonight. We also saw an altercation in the parliamentary precinct between EFF leader Floyd Shivambu and News 24 journalist Adrian de Kock. And the Deputy President says there's still a future in politics for disgraced Mduduzi Manana, the former Deputy Minister of Higher Education. Well, with us in the studio is political analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, good evening to you. And thank you for joining us. I mean, I suppose one of the first things we need to talk about, if we look at Tom Moyane's suspension, it is the President's prerogative to hire and fire, is it not?
Yes, it is. But the problem that we tend to have with political appointments is that there's always a risk that the President and that particular appointee will have a fallout. And what has happened historically is that whenever there is such a fallout, we see these payouts where a person is paid out the remainder of their contract. And then in addition to that, somebody's either appointed as an acting person or as a replacement. So we've got this habit as a country of then paying twice for essentially the same service, simply because of the nature of how these engagements and how these appointments are made. So perhaps a question we should be debating is, should we have so much power being centralized on one man being the President? Because if you look at the Moyane case, the reason we couldn't do anything about him for the past 4 years is that, of course, the political principal at the time, who was the only one that could have removed him, was President Jacob Zuma, who enjoyed a very good relationship with Tom Moyane. So we were stuck with him. So I think going forward, we should start interrogating whether this is the way people of that particular those types of civil servants should be hired and engaged by the state.
But it is the nature of the beast, because of course President Ramaphosa has spoken about renewal, he's spoken about changing what has happened, particularly the rot in our public institutions. He's right to say that Sars has lost the confidence of the public. We're seeing, in fact, that revenue targets as far as collection is concerned are being blamed for a number of issues that have happened at Sars. What can he do?
Well, the reality is that a person like Tom Moyane doesn't feel that he's particularly responsible for whatever the shortfalls in the revenues are. The key issue here is that what Cyril Ramaphosa was hoping is that Tom Moyane will be a person that says, let me put the interests of the country first, let me walk away. But that's clearly not that's not what happened. And there's also this disconnect that we have between our labor laws and sort of what tends to happen in these political appointments, in that in as much as you might not like the person who occupies a particular position in the civil service, what trumps that is obviously the fact that we have to respect the labor laws. And it is in the process of trying to respect those labor laws that we see these massive payouts. We saw President Jacob Zuma paid a man 17 million rand on the basis that he was scared that this man might persecute him. We as the taxpayers end up paying for that. And perhaps we should then start engaging on the question of, does it make sense for us to keep making these punitive payments on the basis that we are stuck with a system that simply doesn't talk to each other? And
we saw where that ended up as far as the Mxolisi Nxasana matter is concerned. But if we come back to Tom Moyane, I mean, does he have a point in saying that whether you like him or not, there's due process? He can't be dismissed on the basis of media reports, certainly not without being able to put his version of events to the President. He does have a point.
Yeah, he does. And we've seen this happening, unfortunately, with President Cyril Ramaphosa, where a few weeks ago there was this press announcement saying that Matela Koko should be removed from Eskom. But of course, the way Matela Koko ended up being an executive at Eskom was a very, very thoroughly thought out process. And you can't just issue a press release to say that this person must be dismissed. That is a violation of that person's right to say, why are you dismissing me from a position that when you hired me, you thought I was good enough for? So similarly with Tom Moyane, we may not like him as a human being, but of course we cannot then seek to violate the way processes ought to work, because then it sets a precedent. And it's not a Tom Moyane situation, it's a question of you and I who are not in the public service who want to be secured by a particular employment contract. So if the head of state then gives the impression that it doesn't really care about labor laws, what does it say to people who are invisible, people who are hired in the private sector, who are then going to say, but how secure are we in the labor regime if an employer can simply decide on the basis of a press release to then say that I'm dismissed? So we need to be careful about what it is that we do in order to dismiss people that we've decided we do not like.
Of course, you're not a labor lawyer, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but how challengeable is this position, is this suspension?
I think it's a question of President Cyril Ramaphosa being able to say that this was not an arbitrary decision. So just because a person has got a presidential prerogative doesn't mean that they can abuse such a prerogative. So the president will then have to outline that on the basis of the things that I've considered, I do not believe that you are desirable as a person who runs this particular institution called Sars. And of course, Tom Moyane should then be in a position to say, yes, I agree or I disagree with the points that you've made. And if they do not reach a meeting of the minds, that's when then the labor courts come in, the CCMA process comes in, where they then simply ask the question, was the employee treated fairly? So I think that's where we're going to gravitate towards. And the reality, of course, is that Tom Moyane is probably not going to end up with a job in the civil service anyway. So for him, this is, as you know, this is his last step. He will hold on for as long as he can, and in the hope that he's probably going to get a good payout.
Well, today's other big story that we discussed, that we want to discuss rather, is this fracas outside Parliament with the EFF leader, the deputy leader, Floyd Shivambu, and a journalist. He's apologised. The journalist is still laying criminal charges. How's that all going to be playing out politically for the EFF?
I think what you will see, we've already seen that the ANC chief whip has released a statement to say, you know, it's completely unacceptable that a person who is that senior, being the chief whip of an opposition party, can behave like that within the parliamentary precinct. But of course, even when you read that statement, you got the impression that it doesn't matter whether it was a parliamentary precinct, whether it was in a club, nobody should be beating up another human being anyway. So I think what you're going to see, that politically people are going to sort of raise the focus and say, but perhaps all our parliamentarians have got this problem of not being able to control their rage. We see this on the back of what happened in Duduzi Manana, and of course his violation was, you know, taken to the courts. He was found guilty. So I do suspect that the journalist is going to still insist that the matter must be pursued in court. The apology itself, it was a good PR exercise on the side of the EFF, because then of course he's not running away from accountability, but that's not where it ought to stop. People need to be called to account for the way they behave in public.
But once again, you find this idea that politicians are exposed in this way, and were it not for footage taken by bystanders, we wouldn't actually even know it's come to this. Now the Deputy President in Parliament saying today that the ANC doesn't throw its own away, and almost defending Duduzi Manana. And as we build up to Human Rights Day tomorrow, how does all of this play out? The sense that there's a dissonance between what the law tells us and what political leaders are prepared to admit to and commit to politically.
It is remarkably unfortunate, and remember, on the basis of the fact that we still have ongoing issues around violence, particularly against women, you wouldn't expect a party that calls itself the leader of society to then find itself in a position where it then has to explain why it sort of still maintains the services as an MP of a person who's actually been convicted of such violent crimes. But of course, you then also have to understand that a person like David Mabuza is incapable of interfering in the ANC's own electoral processes. We saw in Nasrec that Dumanana was actually elevated to the NEC of the African National Congress. So perhaps a bigger question should be, will the ANC be bold enough to then say, actually, as a political party that wants to be a leader of society, we're going to take a position that whenever a person is implicated in matters of this nature, we do not want that person to be our public representative, simply because it sends a wrong message, especially in light of the offense that he was found guilty of.
Right. Thank you, Khaya Sithole, for your analysis and your points. That was political analyst Khaya Sithole.